Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our presentation today. I'm Dr. Anisha Dervey, and I'm super excited to be doing kind of our first online webinar and inviting the SOAR community to come join us for this presentation. We just joined the SOAR community earlier this year, I think this spring. So we're really happy to see so many different organizations are connected. And we're just really impressed with all the great work that all of you do so tirelessly every day. So the title of the session today is called Breaking the Myth of Being the Perfect Indian Wife and How Cultural Stereotypes Can Lead to Abuse. And this is true of many different cultures have their own different stereotypes. But specifically, I'm going to be kind of talking about my upbringing in the Indian culture and also kind of the larger South Asian community and how these stereotypes, I think, really are kind of the perfect recipe to lead many young women towards becoming victims of abuse and victims of gender violence. So, our nonprofit is called the Power to Break Free Foundation. I started this organization in 2012, and that was the same year that I published my book, my memoir about my story of being a victim. So, the mission statement for our organization is to inspire, empower, and liberate women who suffer from gender violence, to break free from abusive environments, to heal from trauma, and to rebuild their lives with dignity. A little bit just about my personal background is I am a doctor of acupuncture, an Ayurvedic doctor, a yoga therapist, a meditation instructor. And so I come from this background of wellness, of integrative medicine. I have in my practice specialized in women's health, emotional health, specifically specializing in PTSD and recovering from trauma. So I've seen countless people over the years coming in with those specific mental, emotional, or physical health issues and try to help them in their journey of recovery. All right. So a little bit just about the book that I wrote, The Power to Break Free. This was really written because at the time that I discovered I was a victim of domestic violence was 4 years into my marriage. I was married for 7 years, and those first 4 years were just a web of confusion. I didn't understand what was happening to me. I didn't understand how I was losing my voice. There was just, a lot of gray area where I couldn't make sense of the abuser's actions. And so at the time that I started to educate myself and realized I was a victim, I tried to get my hands on every book that I could read on this topic to understand how does abuse happen to somebody like me, someone who's grown up in this country, who's been well educated, who's an advocate for women's rights. It just really didn't add up to me how I got into that situation. And as I was researching and looking at other books, there were a lot of books that were written by men, that were written by counselors, therapists, not a lot of books by victims themselves. And I realized it was really important for me to try to hear from not only women who were victims who had gone through experiences like mine, but I really wanted to find out, how does somebody get to the other side of this? How do you recover from this? How do you build a life of dignity after going through the horrendous abuse that you have gone through? And so I essentially wrote the book that wasn't out there that I was really looking for, and I needed to understand the psychology of abuse. What were all the steps that broke me down, that made me give up my voice, that led me to be conditioned to become a victim? I also wanted to know, how did this happen to my abuser? How did he get to this place where this was the only way he knew how to operate, was to try to have control over me? I also wanted to break down the cycle of violence, to understand the role of community And also within our own culture, how is this supported? How is this, you know, encouraged? How are abusers not held accountable? So the first part of my book is all about that psychology of abuse. The second section is really about my fight for freedom, where I just share my own personal story from meeting my abuser, getting engaged, getting married, that whole journey, all of my turning points of abusive incidences, when I started to realize it was a pattern, my steps to get out, my steps to heal, the influence of my family, friends, community, all of those things I share in that personal part two, my fight for freedom. And then the third section of this book, what I realized is that as I was talking to people, even within our own community, I realized there was just a lot of misunderstanding. So when I went, I traveled, I drove 4 hours to find the closest South Asian women's group I could find in my state. And when I went there, they said, oh, well, abuse doesn't happen to girls that grow up in America. This happens to women in India. And then I was told, oh, this only happens to the immigrant community. You speak English well, so you must have no issues. You can advocate for yourself. And I was quite surprised at just all of the cultural biases, misunderstandings, and I wanted to correct that. I wanted to be able to share my story and show that abuse happens to everybody. None of those other labels really matter. And then I also wanted to reach out to other women in our community to understand what they were going through and start to interview them, start to share some of their stories. I was told, oh, this doesn't happen in love marriages. This only happens in arranged marriages. And so, part three in the section on voices of Indian women, I've interviewed 5 women with different backgrounds to show that the abuser kind of fits the same playbook in every scenario, whether you're from India, whether you're from America, whether it's a love marriage, whether it's an arranged marriage, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, like none of those things matter. Abuse is the same as a common denominator everywhere. So this is just a little background about my book and kind of my story of creating the book. After I wrote that, I also published a companion trauma workbook because I realized in that, what most women will say is in that survival mode that you go into when you're trying to get out of your marriage or break free or just fight for your right to survive. There's so much that goes into being in survival mode that you often really don't have time for deep reflection or to process your trauma. And so there was just a lot of content that I couldn't share in the book itself that I decided to create a companion trauma workbook so that victims, survivors could really go through very specific exercises to process their experience, to understand the difference between healthy relationships versus non-healthy relationships, to figure out all the steps that they needed to figure out for getting clarity, healing from their trauma, being able to really break free. There's a number of organizations around the country that do purchase this trauma workbook for every woman that walks through their door. I'm so grateful for them that they're able to share this work, sometimes getting grant funding to be able to purchase copies of this for their clientele. But really the idea with the workbook is there is a way to get through this, and there are specific exercises that can really help give you that clarity. So I wanted to share a little passage from my book. Forgive me as I just look down to read this passage, but I did take a couple bullets here out of this paragraph to share and highlight with you. But this section is called Becoming the Perfect Wife, and it seemed appropriate to read this since that's the topic of our conversation today. Becoming the Perfect Wife. I took more initiative to trying to fix our marriage. Every time an abusive incident occurred, I became the therapist, patiently explaining to him the pattern in which we were trapped. I was determined to appeal to his logical, rational side, even though there was no proof it existed. Surely, if he saw how the incident was similar to the last incident, he would have more clarity, right? My explanations, however, only triggered his anger more. He reprimanded me. You are too emotional. You are always harping on the past and cannot let things go. So I graciously forgave my husband and tried to forget these altercations so he would not accuse me of living in the past. I continued to work diligently on myself so we could eventually live an abuse-free life. I strived to eliminate every flaw my husband commented on so he could not criticize or blame me for his ire. I took it upon myself to tend the household, prepare a hot Indian meal every night, and manage our finances so he would not be inconvenienced. I ran errands on weekends and handled all of our moves on my own so he would not stop nitpicking on me. I devoted my time attending to his needs, caring for his mother whenever she came to visit us for months at a time, and playing the role of the obedient Indian wife. I stepped out of the way so mother and son could bond and make up for all the lost time when they had not seen each other, even if I felt left out. I distanced myself from my priorities and immersed myself in doing everything I could for his family. I forgot what was important to me and neglected my own needs, losing myself completely in this process. It was only a matter of time before the inevitable disintegration of my being. And I share this passage because this idea of becoming the perfect Indian wife is a cultural concept. It is something that many of us in this community have grown up with this conditioning since we are a young girl, where it's not about figuring out our own needs, our own priorities. It's really a process where it's impossible to not lose yourself in that process. So, where does this kind of idea of becoming the perfect wife come from? It really starts before anybody gets married. It really starts at a young age with the cultural conditioning we have in the Indian community, the South Asian community, really in many Asian cultures in general. And so I have a long list here of virtues of the perfect Indian wife. I won't read through all of them, but I'm sure as you guys look at this list, you can relate to a lot of these qualities and traits and see how this is a really big part of this culture, that women are taught to be obedient, subservient, patient, kind, loyal, really putting the husband first, putting the family first, putting children first. There's a very strong sense of service and surrender and kind of placing everyone else before you. And I don't want to say this is just a cultural thing. I think this is in general a gender thing. I see this with women across the board, regardless of their nationality or background, is women in general do tend to put men first and put themselves last. I see this a lot with mothers, of course. They neglect a lot of their own needs. They're busy tending to their kids. And so it is something that I think all of us need to be kind of aware of is where do we lose ourselves in this process of trying to fit cultural expectations, of trying to fit just kind of that idea of being the perfect partner, being the perfect wife, being the perfect family person. And so as you look at this list, whether you've had this experience yourself or whether you work with clients who've had these experiences, this is a really big burden to carry. And we can see when you're carrying this big burden before even entering into a marriage, then when you enter into a marriage, the expectations only increase. And so we can see if you're in a marriage where it is not safe, it is not healthy, it is abusive, that there can be a big conflict with everything you've been conditioned to believe about being the perfect wife, taking care of your husband, that this really enables the abuser significantly. And there's so much weight placed on the women's responsibility without there being equal weight placed on the man's responsibility in this partnership. So, as we're looking at cultural norms, I took a couple quotes out of my book just in terms of common phrases, adages that I've heard, and maybe some of you have heard these phrases as well. Marriage comes first and love comes second. So, this is what I had always heard when it comes to arranged marriages, where it didn't make sense. How can you have a marriage that's not based on love? But this idea is that you grow to love your spouse, you grow to love your partner. Love will come later, but the first responsibility, the first duty is towards marriage. Also, another phrase here is as daughters, women are cherished as temporary guests in their parents' homes. And, nowadays in modern age, we have all sorts of different living situations. But if we look at these cultures that are centuries old, the common norm was living in joint families with multiple generations all under one roof. And the idea was always that daughters were only living in that home temporarily until they got married. And the expectation was at the time of marriage, you moved into your husband's home where he lived with his family and his parents and his siblings. And so this is something that maybe has changed in modern day and age for folks like us that live in the USA. But if you go to India or many other South Asian countries, this is still the norm where women are uprooted from their home. They go to live in their husband's home because of finances or whatever reasons. They might still continue to live in that joint family structure. And we can see how this is a perfect recipe for abuse as well when you're kind of outnumbered in that type of situation. I also heard a lot growing up this phrase that the woman must be the one to adjust in marriage, to make accommodations, to appease her husband, that was just kind of the expectation. And also the phrase, the less you expect in a marriage, the happier you will be. So that's kind of sad to hear that, but I think a lot of women in South Asian cultures, go into the marriage with that kind of thinking. That's kind of what the advice that they've gotten from other females. So I want to share a little graphic that I do have in my book where I try to break down the different aspects of the Indian female identity. And I use Indian just because that's how I label myself. I am speaking of the larger South Asian community here, but I might not always say South Asian. So I'm just going to use those terms interchangeably between Indian and South Asian. So in this graphic, if you look at the larger circle here, it's talking about our cultural identity. And this is really true of all Eastern cultures, not just South Asian, but Eastern cultures in general focus on the community and the culture over the individual. So it's only in Western cultures that we focus on the identity of the individual, and we place that over the communal identity. And so as we look at this larger circle, that cultural identity is what most women are identifying with when they think about this myth of being the perfect Indian wife, fitting all of those characteristics that we just looked at on the previous page. And so this is something that's really important when we're trying to work with a woman who's gone through abuse, who's a victim of trauma, is what is their identity? What are they identifying with? And even though it's the individual that has to kind of break free from that abusive situation, We have to see kind of the layers that she's identifying with that might be trapping her or oppressing her. And so that cultural identity takes on that larger identity that we have to kind of speak to first. The family identity is what comes next. So, how a woman is identifying with her family structure, whether it's being in a joint family and living with an extended family, just whatever that sense of family identity might be. To break free from abuse can often be seen as being disloyal to your family, walking away, from that abusive situation is walking away from all of those family members that are there as well. And so the third layer is really that individual identity. But it's hard to reach that level without first addressing the cultural nuances, the family nuances. And really, that even that individual identity is not the stopping point. But once we can get to the level of the individual, we can really start to go inwards to access that person's core spiritual self, their beliefs that shape their individual identity, their core philosophies that they live by. And so what I found for myself as I was trying to break free from abuse is I had to look at all these different aspects of myself, and I couldn't really break free while neglecting one of these layers. That I had to kind of tear apart each of these layers to see who am I really that is trying to break free, and how am I going to support each of these different identities of myself? So, from everything we've discussed, you can see kind of the seeds of abuse are being planted here. We start to see the gender inequality patterns of how boys are oftentimes favored over girls in many South Asian cultures. And there was an economic reason for this. If the girls are going to get married and go live in their husband's house, then the sons are going to be the ones that stay with you and take care of the parents, take care of the property, raise the grandkids. And so boys were just seen as a much more precious commodity over the centuries because of that value, economic value that they brought. So I think some of these patterns have changed now in the modern day and age as women have entered the workforce. That's, of course, uprooted a lot of these different ideas, but there's still a very strong hold of this global pattern of patriarchy, regardless of what culture you might be in. I know there's a few exceptional places maybe where that isn't true, but overall, patriarchy is still kind of the dominant energy that we all have to kind of face and to deal with. So another part of this, the seeds of abuse, is really that if women are raised to think that their duty is marriage and their duty is upholding the family at all costs, then we can see why divorce is such a taboo topic, why it's something that's considered so forbidden, and people just don't want to go there. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to address it. Statistically, at the time that I wrote my book in 2012, the divorce rate in India was 1%. The divorce rate in America at the time was around 51%. And I think those statistics are still fairly common. So it's not that 99% of marriages in India are happy and successful. It's just that there is a very strong taboo against divorcing your partner even if you're unhealthy. I'll share a story about an Indian woman I met around the same time that I was going through my divorce, and she was going through the same experience. She was an immigrant here, originally from London. Her family was still back in London. And so we were kind of sharing, comparing our stories. And when she finally made the decision to divorce, to leave her abuser, she called up her parents to share with them what she was going through. And her father was protesting. And so this woman said to her father, "Don't you want me to be happy?" And her father's response was, "No, I want you to be married." And that really struck me, hearing those words, because I felt so lucky that my family didn't react that way and were very supportive of me getting out of my marriage and were supportive of, everything I had to do to go through my divorce. But I realized how that was not true for everybody. And as hard as it may be to get away from your abuser, it's even harder when you have no support to do that, and you have to really kind of walk that path on your own. Another quote here I want to share from the book is breaking free is an extraordinary measure requiring a woman who's being abused to overcome her perception that she has failed as a wife in fulfilling her duty. And this is something that came up with a lot of the women I was interviewing as I was traveling around the country, writing this book, visiting different women's organizations that were dedicated to supporting victims and working with survivors. And I just saw everyone that I talked to had this very strong sense of duty and failing that duty, even if they were able to see that the abuser's actions were not okay, were not healthy. There was still kind of this feeling of failure because of really, I think, the cultural conditioning that we must be married at all costs, and that duty of marriage comes first before the individual and fulfilling the needs of the individual. Another quote, I'm not sure, I can't remember now who said this, but this is all taken from my book where I do give credit to this line. But there's another author that said, disrespect is the soil in which abuse grows. And I think that's really important as we start to look at the seeds of abuse, is what is the origin